Well, welcome to the Discovery podcast. This is our mini series where we're deep diving into our Full House series that we started just on the weekend at Discovery. In this series, we're talking all things relationships, families, marriages, and we're talking about God's big vision for our relationships, that his heart is that our relationships would thrive, that they would flourish, and that we would see wholeness and health in those spaces. So today on the podcast, I've got Tiani Greenwood joining me and also Doug Paws, two of the pastors on our team. Excited to have you guys here today
Great to be here.
That's so good.
Open up our series. So usually the way we do this is give a little bit of a recap on the message on the weekend, and then we're going to dive into some questions and love to hear your guys' thoughts on some of the things that we talked about across the weekend and have a look at what's coming down the line in this series as well. So we launched our Full House series on the weekend, and the big idea I was sharing with our church on the weekend about laying a strong foundation, and we looked at Matthew chapter 7, the parable that Jesus tells of the wise and foolish builder, wise and foolish builders, and about building a solid foundation, the builder who builds upon the rock versus the builder who builds his house upon the sand. And when the storms come and the wind blows and, the seasons of life that come our way, that having that faith that's built on a strong foundation, on bedrock, is the thing that helps us to weather the storms and the seasons of life that come. And so it was a great way to open the series, and we looked at some really practical ways of how do we keep Jesus at the centre? How do we reestablish him at the foundation?
Awesome.
And we talked a bit about how easily the drift can happen, where we feel like we've laid a really strong foundation, but things happen in life. We have challenges, obstacles, trials and hardships and all kinds of things, just seasons change. And sometimes without realising, our priority or our foundation can shift away from being set on Jesus, and we can end up being at the centre of that circle ourselves.
Yeah.
Or sometimes we place the focus all on our kids or on our partner or on work. It could be any number of things which can take that place of Jesus at the centre. But really looking forward to exploring that over the course of the series and how we keep Jesus at the centre and what he has for us in our relationships. But just to get us started, love just to hear some first thoughts from you guys as you reflect on the message from the weekend. What stood out to you? Anything you've walked away still thinking about that would just be great to get our conversation going.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that stood out was that the quote that you used from Brené Brown about white knuckling different things in our lives, and so it just made me think. When you're hanging on to something so tight, your hands aren't in a posture to receive. Like, you can't receive from God in those moments because you're just hanging on so tight to whether it's your kids or even speaking to a couple of people on the weekend about their own personal vision of what they thought things were going to turn out like, and things have gone askew, and so you go, how do you open yourself up to God again in that space? So that because I really loved that diagram that you had that had us in the centre, and Jesus, he isn't even in the next concentric circle. He's like outside that. And sometimes that happens really quickly, but sometimes it drifts out there. We'll probably talk about a bit about that. But yeah, just people's inability to receive from God in that space, to put him back in the centre. And I think that's where people feel the disconnect between what their vision for their life is and what the reality of their life is sometimes. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me, Joe. It's like thinking about just around the relinquishing of control, but also just how we can totally just hold on to things too much, and the art of surrendering. And I think it's so easy, like you said, and I was so encouraged by just your vulnerability in the piece, but just we can totally take it on ourselves to make it up, or to do it on our own. And that ability just to definitely just do it by ourselves, like make it up ourselves. And we don't trust that God has got it. And we don't believe that God's going to show up. So we'll take it on ourselves to do it. And so, and I think that can be totally so easy to do without realizing, and that's the drift. Like we can go there.
I think of all the things in our lives, our relationships are probably one of the hardest things to trust the Lord with.
Totally.
Particularly when they're not going well, or the plan gets disrupted by any manner of things. It can be so hard to trust God with that, because they're the people closest to us in our world, and we want to take control when we feel like, hang on a minute, this isn't working out, or this isn't going the way I thought it would. And I think I shared on the weekend, sometimes in my life where I felt like, God, I'm not sure you've got this covered. I think maybe I need to step in, because maybe I've got a better plan than you. But it's so challenging, that idea of relinquishing control. Easy to say, hard to do. Maybe while we're just talking about that, how do you guys go about that when you notice yourself maybe grabbing on too tightly to something or someone, or you notice, I'm not sure if I've surrendered that to God, if I'm really trusting him with that? How do you go about relinquishing control, or do you have any mechanisms or things in your rhythms or your daily life for how you would do that?
It's definitely probably come to the end of myself. It's probably a big an emotional let going for me. And then after that, it's the intentional moments of the everyday of going, I've realized in my thoughts that I've gone back into, I want to do it by myself, or I'm not trusting. And then it's just guarding my own thoughts in that and bringing them back into, oh no, God, you do have this. I do trust you. But that your thought life is a huge part of it. Like,
massive.
Yeah.
I think for me it's about having the close relationships around me that can hold me accountable in that space, like people who know me, like my wife Mel, friends who are really close to us, who can go, are you okay? Like what your mood has changed, or you're presenting something different than what you normally do. Is there something going on that you want to talk about? And having those conversations again just remind you to, be vulnerable and accountable to other people for that space, so that you can be vulnerable and accountable to God again, have those conversations, but then bring those things to God, because ultimately he's who you want to restore that relationship with, and to have that closeness and intimacy. So, I think those relationships really help.
One of the things I've noticed in my own life is that when I'm struggling to, surrender a particular relationship to the Lord, or something that's going on in a relationship even, I notice myself obsessing over it, and it consumes all of my headspace and my thoughts, and I'm thinking about, how is that going to be resolved? What conversation do I need to have next? And it just becomes all consuming. And I've learnt to notice when that happens. But for me, one of the most helpful things is actually just being able to, usually it's because I'm fearful of the outcome of it not going well, or of I'm nervous about having to have a hard conversation. And so I get all caught up and anxious on the inside, and it just, it spirals from there. And so one of the things I've been learning to do and trying to do more as a rhythm or a practice is, when I catch myself in those times, to actually just, for me it helps just to actually write out what is it that I'm fearful of, and what am I worried about, and if it all went wrong, what would that mean, and just going through that process of being able to acknowledge it to myself, even if I can't yet say it to someone else, to acknowledge it to myself and before God, and to be able to get it out helps me get to that place of surrender. And I often find as I'm writing it out, or I'm, praying it out, I get to that place where I'm able to go, God, I'm really afraid, but I want to hand it over to you. And, I want to open my hands to an open hand posture instead of a tight fist posture. And, that sense of peace starts to come from there. And sure, it doesn't always work out exactly the way you want, but developing that some kind of rhythm or a way of being able to recognise when you're tight-fisted, and how to move from that place to an open-handed place. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, I'm going to change tack slightly. I shared a quote from C.S. Lewis on the weekend, and I want to read it again for our listeners today. He says this in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, "Imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. And you knew that all those jobs needed doing, and so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he's building quite a different house from the one you thought of. He's throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers and making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace, and he intends to come and live in it himself."
Wow.
It's beautiful.
Tiani, you reminded me of that quote that we reflected on it in last year at something that we did as a team, and you reminded me of it last week, and I thought that would be a great thing to include in the message on the weekend, because it is such a beautiful picture of the bigness and the vastness of God's vision for our lives and for our families, for our marriages, for our friendships. Sometimes we can get caught thinking too small. Our vision's too small, because we're often, we're human and we're looking at things through our earthly eyes all the times, and sometimes we can only just see what's right in front of us. But God's vision for our lives is so much bigger than that. And you mentioned it before, Doug, sometimes when we look at the state of our current relationships, whatever it might be that's going on for you today, whether it's in your friendships, with your partner, with your kids, in your marriage, whatever it is, like the breadth of relationships, your wider family, your siblings, there's a lot. Sometimes it can just feel like where I am and where I want to be is so far in these spaces, is just so far removed from each other. And that idea of, in this particular quote, the contrast between a cottage and a palace.
Yeah.
Like sometimes our mentality and our vision can be only as big as a cottage, but the Lord's building a palace that he wants to come and live in and bring wholeness and health and revival and renewal. So I just love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, what does it mean for you to have a big vision for your life, for your relationships? Because I know that both of you, not all your relationships are perfect. No. You guys are human. You've got complex families and complex stories, and they're beautiful and wonderful and messy and all of that mixed together. And so, just love to hear you reflect on that. What does that mean for you, like thinking about the cottage versus the palace? What's the invitation? How do we stretch to that?
I think sometimes, and this is for people who are followers of Jesus, we get a bit caught up in the temporal stuff. I think we forget sometimes in the actual, like the space of our earthly life compared to what our eternal life is really, really short. And like the Bible talks about that, we're like grass. We're here 1 minute and we're gone, like the wind just blows us away kind of thing. And that kind of thinking for me helps me to remember that the effort that I put into relationships now can have potentially eternal effect. And so it becomes really important then. Like, it's not just that you want to do things so that your life goes smoothly now. You want to actually build into relationships so that there's potential for all of your relationships and the people who are in your world to actually experience that eternal kind of life as well. And so I think that's changed for me over the years. Like when I first got married, I had to get to know a whole nother family. And they were a pretty challenging group of people. And but as I've learnt over the years, like, I'm a pretty challenging person too. So there's been a bit of that to and fro, but recognising as you get to know each other better and you seek the good of the other person, because you're operating out of love and not selfishness, not impatience, not, you know what I mean? You get to choose to exercise those fruits in your relationships so that you both benefit. And and you just see it in a longer term thing. Not so you're not thinking about today that person's really annoying me. Like you're going, if I step into that today, then tomorrow it's going to be better, and the day after that it's going to be better again. So, yeah, I think that idea of we get too locked into the smallness. We don't see the breadth of what God wants to do in those spaces, and I think that's a shame.
Yeah, wow. I think even around the cottage versus palace mentality, sometimes one of the barriers between us understanding that God wants to build a palace within us to live in himself is that maybe we don't feel like we deserve a palace. And I think especially in the context of relationships and how messy that can sometimes be, and like relationships are messy, and because we're bringing our whole selves, human selves into it, and another person's bringing our whole human selves into it. I think the encouragement is to remember that there's grace abundance to become that palace, and God's grace can cover so many things. And as we move into that believing and understanding that there is a palace that he wants to come and build in our relationships and in our houses, just understanding that through what Jesus has done, there is a deserving of it, and there is a what, like we have every right, every grace to be able to believe for the bigger and the better, and in our relationships and in our households. Because of what Jesus wants for us, and because of what Jesus has done.
Like I constantly, more and more, that kind of stuff reminds me of the Apostle Peter. Like here's a guy who follows Jesus for 3 years, becomes best mates, but when it comes to like the last night of Jesus' life on earth, Jesus is betrayed, denied, deserted, but he, 3 days after he's restored. And Jesus does that gently with him. And I think we tend to think, that God's not going to be gentle in those spaces, and he really is.
Yeah.
And then Jesus brings back the idea of the rock again, in that upon this rock I will build my church.
Yeah.
Doug, you're a serial renovator.
Yes.
Of houses, actual houses.
Yes.
Because the thing that I've been reflecting on about that, like going from the cottage to the palace, awesome. The idea of the palace sounds great, but it doesn't come without the renovating work to get it there. Like knocking out the walls and raising the roof and re-stumping or whatever it is, or repainting, because like God's in the habit of restoring us. Sometimes that means he's got to dismantle some things to rebuild them and strengthen them. Sometimes it's a fresh coat of paint, but sometimes it's actually like deep expanding, and I need, this house is too small for you, and we need to grow, we need to move into a bigger house, and we need to add some rooms and add some extensions. And just like when you renovate an actual house, it takes a lot of effort and work, and it's often pain and discomfort and a budget that's overextended and all of those things that come along with it. But I think there's a real invitation for us in this series, and maybe an encouragement for whoever's listening today, to just be curious about that. Like something I've been thinking about is, okay, there's a few things that are going pretty well in my life and my relationships, but how is God wanting to make them better? Or, how does God want to move my marriage and the experience of that and the example of that from something that's good to something that's even better? Or, maybe it's something that's not going so well. But what is it, being curious with God about that, and what is it in me that he's doing? What's the personal renovation work in me? And then from there, what is it that he's wanting to rebuild and restore in whatever relationship it might be? And, maybe that involves him needing, not maybe, I'm sure it involves him needing just to, buff off some rough edges in me that aren't serving my relationships, where I'm not serving my kids well, or I need to grow personally to be able to to really bring my best into those places. So, that's our timer. Sorry, guys. We'll wrap it up in a few minutes, but I don't know what like for you guys, you know, when you've experienced those seasons where you know the Lord's doing a renovating work in you, how do you hold the tension of that? Because sometimes it is painful and uncomfortable, yet life goes on and you've still got to show up for all the things that you're doing in your life, and you've got to show up for the people that are in your world, even when there might be tension there or things might be unresolved or unreconciled. Yeah. Thoughts on how to manage the tension of, and maybe lean into that invitation of the renovating work or that restoring, rebuilding work that God's doing in us.
I feel like, because what I've realised, especially in the context of marriage and relationships, and you touched on it before, is just God can only change us. Like he can't, sometimes he can't.
Pray, God, change my partner, make him stop doing this. Yeah.
Can we just fix all this stuff around me and then I can stay the same? But actually he wants to do the deep work in us
as well.
It probably more, like we probably need to change and we need to move, and the renovation needs to happen in our own hearts. But holding that in the tension of when you're trying to do all that. But I think once the deep work starts happening in us, we probably change our eyes and our lens of how we see things as well. And within all that, we change how we react to things. That can all be the key point to things changing. And
100%. And I think you touched on it on Sunday, Jodes, when you talked about that story of the wise and foolish builders. Like, it's the foundation that makes the difference. It's that heavy groundwork that you do first that holds you steady, even when your house gets buffeted and, you know, windows crack and roof tiles go flying. In those situations, that foundation of your everyday discipleship, which we talk about a lot, but do we really actually actively do it for ourselves, like to be the healthy version of ourselves that other people need? And I think, you know, it's out of that we get to choose to exercise the fruits of the Spirit. Because we do get to choose those things. Like, they're a response to the things that we encounter. Like, you know, if you're having a hard time in your marriage, and everybody does, or if you're having a challenging season with your kids, like, you know, we've got young adult boys now, and we were thinking, you know, once the kids were out of that toddler stage, it'd be easy. And then you go, reality sets in. Then, you know, go, once they're out of school, it'll be easy. And then they hit the teenage years and then the older years, and now the young adults. And it's no easier, but the challenges sort of morph into different things. But when you've got that foundation of relationship with them and foundation of building that openness so that you can have the hard conversations with them, that's where the fruit happens. And I think we need to lean into that.
Sometimes when I had a couple of conversations with people on the weekend who mentioned, you know, at one point in their life they had a really clear picture of a really clear vision for their life and for what God was doing and how he was moving, and then a significant life event disrupted that vision, and then they found themselves in a season of having to come almost back to the drawing board of how do I lean into a new vision for my life that's really different to how I expected. And I guess an encouragement, a great starting point even just in this series is just to be open to letting God speak to us about that. What is the palace that you're wanting to build in my life and in my relationships, Lord? And that takes a lot of courage to open yourself up to that. But one of the other things we talked about, and just to bring this conversation to a close today, because I feel like we could probably talk forever, but we talked about just a couple of practical things that might help us establish that firm foundation in Jesus, or re-establish it if we find we're in a season where we've drifted, or, you know, we need to recenter again. And it wasn't an exhaustive list, so I'm keen to hear what else you guys do. But a couple of things I mentioned were, the first thing was just to locate locate yourself. Where am I right now, and where is Jesus in every area of my life? And because you can't really figure out how you need to move or shift if you don't know where you are.
Yeah, that's good.
So locating yourself is a great starting point. We talked about relinquishing control, which we've already discussed today. We talked about having a rhythm for the word in your life. We talked about, because, that scripture is all about Jesus teaching, and he's given them this whole list of things of how to live his way in the world. And so, the word of God is a roadmap for his best life for us. So if we don't know it, how will we navigate the way? It's an anchor when we need an anchor. It's a shield when we need a shield. It's a weapon when we need a weapon. It's a covering when we need a covering, but we need to know what's in there so we know how and when to use it. We talked about, the invitation to have a bigger vision for our lives and for our relationships, knowing that God's vision is so big.
Yeah.
And the fifth thing we talked about was being anchored in community and the role of being connected in community, in small groups of people who are like-minded, who share the same beliefs and values, because that community is what keeps us steady and upright when the circumstances of life want to blow the boat over. We need those people that are looking out for us, like you said before, to throw the life ring out or just to go, hey, how you going? So that was just 5 things that came to me as I was preparing. That's not an exhaustive list. Just to close, what else for you guys? What do you think are the key things as you reflect on your own life and faith journey across all the different seasons that have helped keep that foundation that firm foundation in Jesus, keep him at the center? When you sense yourself drifting, what is it that you go to that helps bring you back, that might help someone listening today?
I think just taking yourself out for a while, and like we call it Selah leave in our team here at Discovery, where we actually take intentional time to actually recenter ourselves and to think about where we're at and what's going on, because we do live really busy and full lives.
Yeah.
And so stepping out of that pace for a bit, going somewhere different. I've got a favourite place up on Mount Benak where there's one of the fire station view platforms are up there, but there's 2 massive granite boulders next to it. And I go up there and sit there and look over the Yarra Valley, and it's just a beautiful, peaceful space for me to be out of the busyness and just to recenter myself somewhere different. I've found that just get some perspective again, because you just look out at this incredible view in front of you and you think, wow, my worries are actually pretty insignificant. I make them into the bigger things, but God says you don't need to carry all of that stuff. So just be quiet here for a minute.
Yeah, that's good.
That's been a really good thing for me. But again, that's part of that centering yourself, finding out where you are. But that's been really key for me.
That's one of the ways you do that.
100%. Yeah,
that's great. Just taking a pause, we call it get up on the balcony and have a look, because we're just so in the nuts and bolts all the time, head down, bum up, busy in life and all the things that you're doing that sometimes it's hard to actually go, whoa, wow, hang on a minute, where am I? What's going on right now? Yeah, that's good. What about for you, T?
Yeah, I think it's combining some of those things that you've said already, but the in parts, the spiritual disciplines in my life, staying true to them, and the small decisions make a huge difference to keep that foundation going. Just small everyday rhythm, weekly rhythms. That will actually help me. And I realize when I drift, it's when those rhythms are.
What are those rhythms for you?
Sabbath. Making time for different things in my world. Those kind of things. The word, just even silence and solitude, just different rhythms like that. I realised is a huge part. And then the out part of that would be accountability. People in my world that can be like, hey, where's your centre at? What's going on for you? Keeping close to those decisions, to those people, to keep you accountable to those decisions. Because, sometimes those small decisions can go out and you're like, oh, I've drifted. So, have, really good people in your world that can ask you those questions and ask you where have your choices been at. And,
that's awesome.
Keep you accountable for their choices.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us on the conversation today. So many great thoughts. Hopefully for you who are listening, some great things to ponder and reflect on in your week, and also maybe with your small group or with a group of people, and a great opportunity for us to think about how we can create community for other people as well as being anchored to community ourselves. But looking forward to diving into this series again next week. Matt will be on the podcast across Father's Day. He's actually going to be sharing a message on the phases of manhood, which I think is going to be a really interesting one and hopefully really life-giving and empowering for everyone in our community. So they'll be unpacking that next week. But until then, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch up with you really soon.